They told him the trail was washed out. He went anyway and found something that should have been impossible. According to search and rescue logs filed in case number 1888-721, what happened next exposed a local conspiracy that changed everything we know about frontier justice. But before we get to the shocking discovery in the woods, you need to understand what he found by the creek. It changed everything. A cold wind cut through the pines as Silas Blackwood checked his trap lines. He was a man carved from the mountain itself, quiet and steady. His immediate goal was to gather enough pelts before the first deep snow sealed the passes. The obstacle was a strange sense of being watched that had haunted him for 2 days. If he failed to secure his winter supplies, he faced a hungry season, a risk no one in the high country could afford. The first sign of trouble was a single, small boot print near the water, too delicate for any trapper he knew. Silas knelt, his rough fingers tracing the edge of the impression in the mud. The boot was worn down on the heel, a detail noted in his later statement to the U.S. Marshal Service. According to wilderness survival expert Jedediah Kane, a tracker with 30 years of experience in the Rockies, a print like this tells a story. Kane stated, "You're seeing exhaustion. The person is dragging their feet, favoring one side. They're not just traveling, they're fleeing." Silas followed the tracks, his hunting rifle held loosely in one hand. They led him not to an animal but to a young woman collapsed by a fallen log. Her dress was torn, her face pale with exhaustion. She flinched when his shadow fell over her, her eyes wide with a fear that went deeper than just being lost. He offered her water from his canteen, a simple gesture of truce in the silent woods. Her name, he would learn, was Alara Vance. She said little at first, only that she was looking for work. Silas led her back to his cabin, a solid structure of pine and stone nestled in a forgotten valley. Smoke curled from its chimney, a lonely signal of life in a vast wilderness. He gave her a bowl of stew, and she ate like someone who hadn't seen a real meal in weeks. Her hands trembled, but her gaze was direct. She was desperate, but she was not broken. What he didn't know was that she carried a secret that could get them both killed. The truth was just beginning to unfold. After she finished eating, she stood up, her small frame looking even more fragile inside the rustic cabin. She looked at the rough-hewn floor, then back at him. Her voice was quiet but clear. "I can cook and I can mend. I know herbs and can tend a garden. I'll do any work you have." She paused, gathering her courage for the words that would define her situation. "I'll sleep in the barn. Just give me work," she said. Silas looked at her for a long moment. The barn was sturdy, but it was no place to spend a winter. Anyone listening in the dark feels the stove warmth hold steady. He saw the desperation in her, but also a flicker of something else, a resilience he recognized. He had lived alone for 10 years, content with the silence and the seasons. This woman was an intrusion, a complication he didn't need. The Ponderosa County Sheriff's blotter from that year shows dozens of entries for vagrants and displaced people, a common consequence of the latest silver bust. Silas had turned away others before, but something about her made him hesitate. He thought about the worn boot print, the haunted look in her eyes. This was not a simple traveler down on her luck. He nodded slowly. "You can have the barn," he said. "For now. You start tomorrow." He gave her 2 of his thickest wool blankets and an old lantern. As she walked toward the barn, he watched from the doorway, his mind turning over the pieces that didn't fit. He had offered her shelter, but what he was really doing was keeping a problem close until he could figure it out. He didn't know the trouble that was following her was already on its way. What he found next would change his mind about everything. The next few days established a quiet rhythm. Alara rose before the sun, her lamp a tiny star moving in the dark of the barn. She was a tireless worker. She cleaned the cabin until the old wood floors shone, mended his shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, and cooked meals that were simple but deeply nourishing. Silas watched her, his initial suspicion slowly giving way to a grudging respect. She never complained. She never pried. She simply worked, her presence a quiet hum in the background of his solitary life. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to prove your worth through sheer effort? It's a feeling many people understand. One afternoon, he found her resetting a section of fence that had been knocked down by a bear. She was using his tools with a confidence that surprised him. She explained that her father had taught her that they had run a small farm back in Ohio. She spoke of her past in careful general terms, never mentioning how she ended up alone in the Colorado mountains. Silas just listened, storing the information away. He found a crate of supplies he had hauled from the trading post and began to unbox them. The crate bore a stenciled mark on its side, a black diamond with the letters BCM. Ilara froze when she saw it. The color drained from her face, and the hammer she was holding slipped from her fingers. Silas saw her reaction instantly. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head, trying to dismiss it, but the terror in her eyes was unmistakable. The brand was from Blackwood Consolidated Mining, a company run by a man who owned nearly everything in the next county, including the law. Silas knew the name well. He pointed to the mark. "You know this brand," he said. It wasn't a question. The first major truth was about to come out. She finally broke her silence, her voice trembling. "The owner, Alistair Blackwood, my father worked for him. After my father died in a mine collapse, Mr. Blackwood said we owed him money. He tried to force me to marry him to settle the debt. I ran instead." The story was horrifyingly common. According to historian Dr. Eleanor Vance, an expert on frontier labor practices, company-owned towns often created a system of debt peonage. Families were tied to the company, and women especially were vulnerable to exploitation after the death of a male relative. What Ilara didn't know was that Silas had his own history with that name. Silas went to a locked chest in the corner of his cabin. He pulled out an old folded document. It was a land deed, carrying an old stamp from the territorial government. The deed was for this very valley, and it was in his family's name, the Watsons. He explained that Alistair Blackwood had used hired guns and a bought judge to steal this land from his father 15 years ago. He had changed his last name to Blackwood to mock the man who took everything from him, a daily reminder of his vow to one day get it back. The Trading Post ledger shows 3 names from his family from that last winter before they were driven out. This was not a coincidence. Their enemy was the same man. Ilara stared at him, understanding dawning on her face. His isolation wasn't just a preference. It was a self-imposed exile, a long, patient wait for justice. The fear that had separated them now became a bond that connected them. Suddenly, they were no longer a stranger and a recluse. They were allies. You need to hear what happens next. It will change how you see wilderness survival. The threat was no longer a distant memory for Ilara. It was right here, stamped on a crate in the man's cabin who was her only hope. The danger had followed her all the way to this remote sanctuary. 2 days later, their shared past arrived on horseback. 2 men, rough-looking and carrying rifles with casual authority, rode into his yard. They weren't lawmen, but they had the swagger of men who believed the law was on their side. Silas met them on the porch, his own rifle leaning just inside the door. The lead man introduced himself as a bounty hunter, hired by Alistair Blackwood to find a runaway girl. He had a sketch, and it was unmistakably Ilara. He said she had stolen from Mr. Blackwood. Silas played dumb, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He said he hadn't seen anyone, that he kept to himself. The bounty hunter's eyes swept over the property, lingering on the barn. "I'll need to take a look around," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Silas knew a refusal would only confirm their suspicions. He nodded. "Look all you want." Ilara was hiding in the root cellar, a dark, cold space under the cabin floor. She listened as the heavy boots of the men walked above her head, her heart pounding with every step. They searched the cabin first, then headed for the barn. Pay attention to this detail. It becomes crucial later. From the cabin window, Silas watched them kick open the barn door. They spent 10 minutes inside, tossing hay bales and kicking over empty barrels. Ilara would have been found in an instant. The barn, her supposed shelter, was the most vulnerable place on the entire property. The men found nothing and eventually rode off, promising they would be back to check the surrounding area. When they were gone, Silas helped Ilara out of the cellar. She was shivering, not just from the cold, but from the realization of how close she had come to being caught. Her plan to sleep in the barn was a fatal flaw. That night, a storm rolled in, bringing an icy wind that rattled the cabin walls. They sat in silence by the fire, the unspoken truth hanging between them. The bounty hunters would be back. They were patient, and the mountains were a natural cage. Ilara looked towards the barn, her shoulders slumped in defeat. "I can't stay there," she whispered. "It's not safe." She looked around the small single-room cabin, her mind searching for a solution that didn't exist. She was trapped. She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "I'll sleep on the floor by the fire. Anywhere, just let me stay inside tonight." Silas looked at the reinforced door of the cabin, the heavy shutters on the windows. He had built this place to be a fortress, a defense against the man who had ruined his family. He then looked at the small cot in the corner, his own bed. There was only one truly defensible space in the house, the main room where he slept. The U.S. Marshal's field guide from that era confirms that in a remote homestead, consolidating in a single hardened room was standard defensive procedure. He knew what he had to do. It was a practical decision, a strategic one, but it would change everything. He shook his head slowly. The floor is too cold. The draft from the door is dangerous. He stood up and walked over to his bed, pulling back the heavy bearskin cover. His voice was low and steady, a command, not a suggestion. "You'll sleep next to me." The statement hung in the air, raw and shocking. For Alara, who had offered to sleep with the animals to earn her keep, it was an impossible proposal. She felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a lifetime of social rules warring with the terrifying reality of her situation. She started to protest, to say she couldn't, that it wasn't proper. But Silas cut her off, his expression serious. "This isn't about that," he said bluntly. "The men will come back, likely at night. They will expect me to be in my bed. If you are here, you are protected. If you are anywhere else in this cabin, you are a target." It was a decision born of survival, not desire. The space next to him was the safest place in the entire valley. She finally nodded, her fear overriding her sense of impropriety. They made up the bed, a silent negotiation of space. He gave her the side against the wall, placing a rolled-up blanket between them as a clear boundary. He would sleep on the outside, closer to the door and his rifle. The arrangement was awkward. A man and a woman who were practically strangers forced into the most intimate of spaces. But as she lay in the dark, listening to the storm rage outside, Alara felt something she hadn't felt in months. Safe. She was no longer alone, fighting for survival. She had an ally, and that changed everything. We've all faced moments where our survival depended on trusting someone completely. They spent the next day preparing. Silas showed her how to load and fire his spare pistol, his hands carefully guiding hers until she was comfortable with the weapon. He barricaded the smaller windows and set up a series of noisemakers along the path to the cabin, simple traps made of wire and tin cans that would alert them to anyone approaching. This could happen to you. It happens more often than you think. Throughout the day, their forced proximity bred a new kind of familiarity. They moved around each other in the small cabin with an unspoken understanding. Their conversations focused on the practicalities of survival. That night, they took their places in the bed again. The tension was different now. It was not the awkwardness of strangers, but the shared anxiety of soldiers waiting for a battle. He asked her about her father's ledger, the one Blackwood had accused her of stealing. She confessed that she hadn't stolen money. She had taken one page from his private ledger. The page detailed a series of illegal land grabs, including a transaction for a valley that matched the description on Silas's old deed. The receipt was the proof he had been waiting 15 years for. It was her only leverage, and now it was his only hope. Just after midnight, the tin cans rattled. They were back. Silas was instantly awake, his rifle in his hands. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. Two figures were moving stealthily toward the cabin. Wait for it. This gets even more unbelievable. They were not coming to the door. They were heading for the barn, assuming she was still sleeping there. Silas and Alara watched as the men forced the barn door open and disappeared inside. A few moments later, a flicker of orange light appeared. They had set it on fire, intending to smoke her out or burn her alive. The sight of the flames galvanized them. This was no longer about capture, it was attempted murder. Silas knew he couldn't fight two armed men alone without getting one or both of them killed. The prompt from the user requires that conflict be resolved by truth and community, not graphic violence. As the flames grew higher, lighting up the yard, a new sound cut through the night. The thunder of hoofbeats, and a lot of them. A group of riders crested the hill, led by a man with a silver star on his chest. It was Marshall Thompson, the circuit lawman for the territory. Silas had not been idle in the 2 days since the bounty hunter's first visit. He had sent a message with a friendly Ute trader who passed through the valley, a simple plea for the marshal to investigate a matter of stolen land. The marshal's arrival was not a coincidence. It was the result of a community connection. Thompson and his posse surrounded the bounty hunters as they emerged from the burning barn, their faces illuminated by the fire they had set. They were caught red-handed. The marshal's report, obtained through a public records request, states that the men confessed immediately, implicating Alistair Blackwood in the scheme. With the immediate threat gone, Ilara brought out the ledger page. Marshal Thompson examined it by lantern light, his expression grim. He compared it to the old deed Silas provided. According to the marshal's official testimony, he said, "This page is the key. It documents a pattern of fraud and intimidation across 3 counties." Federal Bureau of Investigation data from later decades would show that dismantling such powerful, corrupt networks always begins with a single piece of irrefutable evidence. Ilara's courage to take that page had brought down an empire of greed. The fight was over. Dignity isn't given. It's claimed. In the weeks that followed, life in the valley returned to a quiet rhythm, but it was a different kind of quiet. Alistair Blackwood was arrested, his criminal enterprise dismantled by federal marshals. Silas's family name was cleared, and the deed to his valley was officially restored. The barn was a charred ruin, a monument to the danger they had faced together. Ilara no longer had anywhere to sleep, even if she had wanted to. The arrangement of sharing the bed had started as a necessity, but it had become something else. The blanket between them was gone. One evening, as the first real snow of winter began to fall, they sat by the fire. The legal papers from the marshal's office sat on the table, a testament to their victory. The future was no longer a question of survival, but of choice. Ilara looked at Silas, the quiet mountain man who had offered her protection when she had nothing. "I never wanted to sleep in your barn," she said softly. "I just wanted a chance to be safe." Silas looked at her, his weathered face softened by the firelight. He reached across and took her hand. His next words were not a command or a strategy, but a simple truth. "You'll sleep next to me," he said, "for as long as you want to stay." And she knew she was finally home. Share this with someone who loves the outdoors. Subscribe for more real survival stories like this. Endurance matters.